Hi. Does it happen? So we have 28 approaches to go. It has been one of the most demanded videos.
The different approaches have a different focus. If you take your hand,
Is like the bone to the dog.
very nice, and then you take your other hand,
And then we have real world, we have meta evaluation all along the evaluation.
here the focus is
So here are the 28. Are you tired, Michael?
this chance to look across and to think together.
You can talk about it for hours. Hopefully, this was, in a nutshell, evaluation approaches.
Like to work with you as ever.
I'm so lucky. Hi, I'm Sara Vaca, and I'm here with the amazing Michael Patton. Welcome to this series about the periodic table of evaluation. The table is a structured view of the field of evaluation organized in 14 categories that every evaluation deals with, either if it is explicitly or not.
Category will have to be addressed in any evaluation, and what it constitutes is a menu of options to help navigate the complexity of design, a control panel of possibilities to facilitate making deliberate choices in the design process, and a set of starting points for discussion as you engage in design and implementation. So it's a way of helping guide the decision-making process and evaluation.
So what we're doing here is diving deep into each of the categories, one video at a time. And today, we're going to deal with evaluation approaches. Evaluation approaches is category number 10 in the table, has all these 28 different options that you can see here. And we're gonna be talking about it because it has been one of the most demanded videos, right, Michael?
And approaches is really a matter of what the focus is for any given evaluation. Sometimes that isn't explicitly stated, but we think it ought to be. And the different approaches have a different focus. So one way to help think about the importance of focus is if you take your hand and you look at the center of your hand, and then you take your other hand and you look at the center of that hand, and then I say, look at the center of both hands at the same time. You can't do that. You can go back and forth, but you can't focus on the center of both hands at the same time. You have to focus on one thing or the other. That's what focus is. And so focus means when you take an approach, you're choosing to focus on one particular kind of issue, one particular kind of problem or concern, and that's what defines what an approach is what the focus is. That leads to priorities that are within that focus, and that's what we're going to take a look at as we go through these different approaches.
Mm. That happens when you want to look people in the eye also. You can only look one eye or the other, which is
Yes, very nice.
Yeah. Okay. So the way we will go about it, as usual, is the approaches are categorized or classified by our different frameworks that you're familiar with: results, learning, critical change, systems and complexity transformation, or those that are neutral or static. And we will go framework by framework. So if you remember, had a mapping of evaluants of all the different units we can look into as an object of the evaluation. And for approaches, we will be using programs or networks most of the time. So we have 28 approaches to go. Let's start a results-based approach, which is a very, very famous one, right?
So, I mean, this is the beginning of evaluation, is focusing on whether the program delivers on planned outputs and results. The goal-based approach, that's sort of evaluation 101, and the field has grown from there.
Mm-hmm. And then we have this variation of goals-based, which is goal-free, which I've never used in real practice, but just knowing that it exists, I love it. Goal-free evaluation.
Goal-free was Michael Scriven's concern that when goal-based evaluation, the goals were chosen usually by funders and staff, and his concern was, what do participants really need? So goal-free was the idea that you, in the evaluation, find out from participants what their needs are and whether the needs are actually being met by the intended goals. We get sometimes at a version of goal-free when we look at side effects or unintended consequences or additional goals beyond the goal-based. But this approach reminds us that the focus upon predetermined goals may not capture all of the desired outcomes, which is also made more explicit by the next approach.
Can I say something about this one? I always remember that in my master's degree in evaluation, my teacher, Juan Andrés Ligero, always said that the log frame is to the evaluator like the bone to the dog. So they throw us the log frame and we're like, let's find it. And so this approach called free liberates us or free us from the bone. So the next one is outcomes harvesting. This was created by Ricardo Wilson Grau. And this one focuses on identifying outcomes or results as they emerge from the conversations, right? From the methods.
This is especially appropriate where people are working on problems that are highly dynamic. They're coming together. They're trying to figure out what to do in real time, working together. And that's a way of working that doesn't necessarily have predetermined goals, that you're figuring out what you're doing as you go along because the problems are dynamic. It's a collaboration. People are working together. And so outcomes harvesting is a way of acknowledging that we don't always operate under plan your work your plan, top down, preconceived, but that things are emerging in complex dynamic systems. And outcomes harvesting is a way of finding what those outcomes are as they emerge.
Mhm. Great. And now we have a particular case of results based, which is gender focused. This one focuses on looking into how the results were different for men or women, or how the program was different for men and women, right?
And so the part of the that approach is in each of these, it's identifying something that's especially important contained within that approach. And the gender-focused approach is really saying we are still in a world where there are always gender issues. There are no programs or projects that don't have gender issues. And therefore, this approach calls our attention to pay attention to that and look at what those differences are. Whether the funder thinks that's important or not, it's always there.
Mm-hmm. Great. So all these four talk about how outcomes were achieved. Now we have a couple of them that talk about attribution. So the first one, also very famous, is the experimental approach and looks for the explicit link between the intervention and the results, right?
And so there's a natural progression here of having begun with, is the program or intervention achieving outcomes? And if they are, the obvious question is, can we attribute those outcomes to the intervention? The experimental design takes a traditional research approach to that. The next approach, realist approach, focuses more specifically on identifying the specific mechanisms that bring about change within a specific context. And so that depends more upon theory than it does upon a experimental design.
Does this mean that an impact evaluation will always have these two approaches?
Usually only has one. I mean,
Oh, sorry,
you
one of
don't,
those. Yeah.
yes, one of those. If the language of impact evaluation, one version of that is that you're particularly looking at attribution, but impact evaluation can also include the top four. What are the impacts?
Sure. Okay. So now also we have quality control that focuses on how processes and outputs meet standards.
So the
Um,
difference here is that where experimental and realist approaches are looking at attribution, quality control is looking at the process in the intervention to make sure that it's well done and meets standards.
mhm. Okay. And then we have real world approach. This one is realist, but this one is realistic, right? Like in real world. It works with the limitations and the constraints of real life, right?
You do what you can, and it's a recognition that there's always limited resources and limited time, and especially in the arena of nonprofits and civil society organizations, um, the resources are often quite limited, but you can still do some meaningful evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Cool. So now let's move to the next framework, which is learning. So, linked to the outcomes harvesting, we have the outcomes mapping that focuses on how different partners contribute differently. Is that how you would explain it?
I mean, part of the emphasis here is being sure that the outcomes are behavioral outcomes and that especially where there are multiple actors or organizations working together, a outcome map looks at what each of them is contributing to those outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So you mean if there are no behavior change involved, that wouldn't be an approach to recommend?
They would say that there should always be a behavior if you're doing outcomes because that's what outcomes should be, are behavioral. And just to have people change their minds isn't much of an outcome. But yes, if you had a project that was just trying to change people's minds, the outcomes mapping would say, well, why are you trying to change their minds? What's going to be different if you change their minds? So it pushes the behavioral content where that often hasn't been made very explicit.
Mm-hmm. Then we have continuous quality improvement. I've never used this as an evaluation approach.
It really comes out of the private sector, where it has long-standing in manufacturing been looking at how to improve effectiveness and efficiency in particular of a process. So it's been brought into the public sector and the intervention of the kinds that go on in public policy to try to take that focus on continuing to adapt to make things more efficient.
And what we mean here is that we can use that for interventions for evaluants more typical from the nonprofit.
That's right. It's bringing in that notion that as you learn, as you engage in something, you capture the lessons of that and work at making it better on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Now we have responsive evaluation that is going to respond to the users or the stakeholders' needs, right?
This is a big transition in the history of evaluation of moving from just the funders and evaluators determining what the evaluation ought to be to saying, let's find out what the people who are going to be using the evaluation or are involved in it. It can include finding out from participants what they think is important to look at in the program. And the language has evolved into now we're talking more about interest holders than stakeholders because stakeholders has some colonial history to it. But it's finding out from the people who would really be affected by the evaluation what they think is important to do.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Now we have a prescriptive inquiry that I think I've heard Tessie Casavas saying that it's both an approach and a method and a design. Like it's three in one. Basically, it's focusing on what is working well, right?
This is in a context where programs that have had bad experiences with evaluation or have experienced evaluation as highly judgmental, they're afraid of evaluation, they have an evaluation anxiety about turning up only negatives. That baggage is often there. An appreciative inquiry was an explicit way of saying, no, let's begin with strengths instead of doing a deficits approach that people worry about. Let's focus on the strengths of the program and apply those to whatever deficits or problems there may be. So again, each of these has a focus that solves a particular issue, addresses a particular issue or solves a problem. Appreciative inquiry really addresses the problem of the negativity that's often associated with evaluation.
Mm, yeah, it's true that it's not an audit and it's not an exam, but often people that go through it leave it like that. Then we have real time. I've seen this approach in humanitarian sector where the intervention is very quick and then we need answers quickly. So real time is like a lighter kind of approach, right?
It's yeah, and it gets applied in things like policing, where if there's suddenly a outbreak of crime, of burglaries in some neighborhood, you put more police over there. It's used in emergency rooms and hospitals. For example, during the pandemic, evaluation had to become very real time because they had to quickly increase the capacity of emergency rooms, and then the hospitals were overwhelmed. They didn't have enough equipment, so it's where things are adapting fairly quickly in any arena that in education and schools during the pandemic, or when there are disturbances in a community and you have to react to that community things happening. The shortages of food can precipitate real-time evaluation. So anything that's volatile leads you to having to adjust very quickly.
Interesting. And finally, in this group, we have meta-evaluation, which is also different from the other ones because it's an evaluation of an evaluation and helps assure quality, focuses on how credible and useful and well-designed is an evaluation system.
This is especially the focus here of meta-evaluation comes from dealing with the credibility issues of high stakes evaluation. High stakes evaluation being where major budgets, major public policy issues are at hand. And so when people don't like the results of an evaluation, they start to attack the evaluation and the evaluator. Meta evaluation is a way of examining whether the evaluation is indeed credible, meets evaluation standards, and therefore ought to be paid attention to.
Okay, and with that, we will move to the critical change framework that has a different lens to it because now what we become activists, right? Where we want evaluation to also be part of the intervention somehow. So the first one would be participatory approach, which is not what I usually read in evaluation reports, or I thought at the beginning is like people were talking about evaluation that has a lot of informants. That's not participatory, right?
Participatory is actually engaging the key actors in the evaluation, and that participation both has an effect upon them, but in the point of view of and focus of participatory is that it's more credible because it's having the participants engage in the evaluation to tell their story.
Mm-hmm.
And the evaluation then first and foremost has to be credible to the participants.
Hmm. On similar lines but different, we have democratic evaluation where we're looking for all the voices to be heard. Is that what we are looking for in this one?
And to be heard and to ideally interact, that they are having a dialogue about those different perspectives, what they see, and that it's also transparent so that the engagement around the findings is open, is transparent, those perspectives are represented and respected as they dialogue together about the implications of the findings.
Mm-hmm. And then we have empowerment that is also very interesting in the sense that it's more than participatory, right? Because what we're focusing on is to strengthen the key actors of the evaluant, right? They become the key actors of the evaluation.
And so the the theory here is that by being engaged in all aspects of the evaluation, what the key questions are, what kind of data should be collected, what do the data mean, that that process of engagement is empowering, that people, instead of having evaluation done to them, if they become the evaluators themselves, and that knowledge and experience is empowering.
Mm. Good. Then we have indigenous that focuses on indigenous values and indigenous knowledge systems rather than Western, right?
This is becoming increasingly important. There is a whole movement of indigenous evaluation in this era where climate issues and sustainability issues are very much a matter of focus. And the history of indigenous peoples living in coherence with the land, with nature, and their respect for nature, their relationships with each other, that there are things that we can learn from those values that affect the future of humanity.
Hmm. Advocacy, what I understand from advocacy evaluation is that this approach, by doing this evaluation, you're doing advocacy already. Is that so?
Advocacy is to use evaluation to find out how policy change is going on so that in the midst of a policy discussion, whatever may be considered by a legislative group, a parliament, a Congress, a board, that as they're considering some change, that the evaluation is gathering data about what they're considering, who's for it, who's against it, what are the lobbying issues going on, what are the information needs, what allegations are being made about the policy that can be checked out with data. And so the advocates are using real-time data in a way to affect the policymaking process.
Mm-hmm. And finally, you have the feminist one that is focusing on gender equity all along the evaluation process.
This goes one step beyond gender, which we looked at earlier, which is saying pay attention to gender differences. The feminist approach specifically is designed not just to pay attention to gender, but to examine the data uh, towards making the relationships in gender more equitable. So it
Mm-hmm.
has an agenda that is fulfilling.
Mm-hmm. With the evaluation as a means to that.
That's right. That's
Mhm.
right.
Okay, well, I think we're more than halfway through, Michael. Let's keep going. Now we enter systems and complexity. So systems thinking, for sure, that's some approach we have heard. The basics of it is interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries. Those are the tools that we use for thinking with systems, right?
In a separate video, we've looked at different evaluands. Systems becomes a different evaluand, a different focus of evaluation. So it moves from project and program thinking to looking at what the system is where an intervention is taking place. And the purpose of the intervention is to change a system, examine it, understand it, and look for leverage points to change the system. And that makes it part of the change process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, we changed the evaluant here. Complexity aware focuses on adaptation.
And here, again, complexity is many different factors operating at the same time, understanding the volatility, the uncertainty of complex dynamic systems. And so, um, what evaluation has traditionally done is simply ignore complexity and do a simple logic model with predetermined outcomes and try to focus upon that. This has emerged to say, no, we can't simply ignore complexity and pretend that we can do a program and cut off all that complexity. We have to deal with the complexity, and that's what the complexity aware approach does, is take into account volatility, again, the pandemic being an example, economic crises, political crises that are going on these days. All of these things make the plan your work, work your plan approach not really germane because things are changing too rapidly. And the complexity aware allows the focus on adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we enter transformation, which goes beyond critical change, right? Because transformation was major changes in some system or in some aspect. Like for example, one of the approaches you have come up with, Blue Marble.
True marble evaluation is acknowledging that many of our issues go beyond not just projects and programs, but go beyond traditional boundaries of countries and regions, that issues like climate change, issues of peace, of global food supplies, of the financial system globally, that these things require a global perspective and that the relationships between humans and nature as we go forward with the uncertainties of climate and the volatility of political systems. Blue Marble is to take the globe as a focus to transform our existing systems to be more sustainable and equitable.
Hmm. Another one is transformative.
Transformative approach specifically by that name is aiming to shift norms, policies, and especially power structures. Make sure that those people who are traditionally at the bottom of the power structure, they are empowered, they are engaged, they're included, and that it is aimed at transforming the elite power structures into more inclusive structures. And that transformation itself in power leads to other kinds of transformations.
Hmm. Can you remind me how you do this in the evaluation? Because this reminds me of an intervention that is trying to do that, but how can the evaluation be transformative?
And the very engagement of inclusive people. So, for example, in the United States, the legislation around disabilities and the efforts to be sure that buildings were accessible, that street corners were accessible, that elevators were accessible for people who are blind, or many of those changes came from having people with disabilities evaluating the existing situation, having their voices heard, having their stories heard, and they were the leading edge of transformation. The same with people with mental challenges or intellectual challenges. That in involving them instead of evaluation done to them, that involving them, elevating their stories, and acknowledging that the existing system cut them out, their engagement is part of the change process.
Mm. It's amazing because I always think I make you very difficult questions out of nowhere while we're explaining these things, and you always come up with an answer right away. Amazing. Now, the colonialized, which focuses on undoing the wrongs from the past, I guess.
This is becoming a very important arena in the global South as we recognize that so much of the language of planning and evaluation is military language. Words like strategy and targets are military language, that the top-down nature of evaluation has treated people as subjects rather than as participants. And the assumptions about how the world works are heavily influenced by colonial views of indigenous people, of people who are subject to colonialism. So, for example, Africa evaluation is very much looking at a made in Africa approach, which includes more spiritual dimensions of the relationship with nature than the West has tended to do, which is the West has a very materialistic and extractive position. And decolonizing is recognizing that evaluation, as has the economy worldwide, been affected by the remnants of colonialization and that those continue. So it challenges us to examine how the history of colonies and colonization has affected evaluation even to the present.
Hmm. And finally, environmental footprint effects are looked if we add this approach, right? Environmental approach.
Here, the focus is specifically on being sure that the nexus between humans and nature is attended to explicitly, that and advocating that any evaluation, given the importance of climate change, should include an environmental component. And that approach illustrates how to incorporate an environmental emphasis into any evaluation to look at the environmental footprint, because every program, every intervention has some effect environmentally, and it elevates that concern to an approach.
Hmm. Yeah. This is true that I haven't seen this much yet, but yeah, it's true that we should incorporate this in each evaluation. Okay, and now let's move finally to the ones that are not into any particular framework. They can be applied to any of them, like for example, another one of your approaches, utilization focused, that makes sure, right, that from the beginning of the evaluation, that the ones that are going to use the findings or the results are involved at the beginning, right?
This utilization focused evaluation is a process for deciding which other approaches you would use. So it's not an approach by itself. It's to decide what approach would you use with an emphasis on being sure that you know who's going to use it and why they're going to use it. That then gives you a focus to what other approach to choose.
Yeah, informs the design. Then we have theory-based that focuses on testing the theory behind the intervention.
So you can have theory at any level, at the project level, at the program level, at the systems level, at the complexity level. But it's making sure that you're not just looking at the logic model, but that you're including in that why you think those changes would occur. A logic model just has to be logical and sequential. It doesn't have to identify the theoretical causal mechanisms. Theory-based says whatever the intervention should be based upon some social science theory about why and how change occurs.
Mm-hmm. And another one of your approaches, principles based, that I love the idea. I have never used, but is focused on instead of results, let's talk about principles, right? Like little sentences that guide our actions. How do you explain that?
Values are things that people believe in, and values are core to evaluation. The word values in the middle of evaluation, and we try to surface values. They affect interpretation. Each of the areas of focus reflects a value. It reflects a priority in some way. What principles do is make values behavioral. So a principle has to have an action verb of some kind. And the reason principles focused evaluation emerged is that in complex dynamic situations where people are figuring out what to do, they're addressing a problem, but they don't yet have goals for that. They're not quite sure exactly what they want to do, but they're guided by principles. So, for example, the civil rights movement um, in the United States, in India, in South Africa, the working against apartheid, they had a big vision about what they wanted to do. They want a more equitable society, but the exact short-term goals at any given moment for a project or an initiative may change quite a bit. But underlying the civil rights movement was the principle of nonviolence, that we won't meet violence with violence, but that we will be nonviolent. And that took a lot of work by the organizers because movements and demonstrations can easily turn violent. So that principle then becomes the guiding light for whatever it is that you're doing. Engaging with participants, for example, with indigenous people, with people with disabilities, with people who have special needs. One of the principles that they have put forth for evaluation is nothing about us without us. So they don't know what the evaluation may cover, but whatever it's going to cover, the principle is nothing about us without us. You have to involve us in any evaluation you're doing. And therefore, that calls upon evaluators to be sure to engage in a respectful and transparent way the people who are affected by an evaluation. That's principles focused.
Mm. Okay, well, this could have been called the Patton's framework. Developmental is the last of the approaches that we're going to cover today. Developmental is evaluative thinking at the service of an innovation. No, that's how you define it at some point. I love this
Uh,
approach.
And this emerged because, again, you go back to results-based evaluation from the beginning and goal-based evaluation. Um, all of those approaches assume some model, some intervention, something that you're trying to do, and we're evaluating whether or not it works. Are the goals attained? Can we attribute the outcomes to the intervention, real-time adjustments? But what it turns out is that we need to be able to apply evaluation when these things are being developed. So traditionally, evaluation didn't come in until there was already an intervention. But there's a role to play in developing interventions, in developing innovations, in adapting along the way with interventions that don't expect to become a fixed model, but continue to respond to changing conditions. So developmental evaluation is a way of engaging evaluation, even in the design of the intervention from the very beginning. When it's just an idea, people are trying to innovate or change or adapt to changing situations. That's a developmental purpose.
Amazing. Okay, so here are the 28. Having done all these, we have some final thoughts about approaches. The first one is that there are many. Are you tired, Michael?
Oh, and I want to say that part of, for me, the joy and the stimulation of working with you is this chance to look across both our separate experiences and to think together about the implications of all these different approaches. Where do they come from? Why are they there? And what are some lessons we can take? And that's really the culmination of the work that we've done together. So these are very much shared insights that come from our discussing these approaches in preparation to making a video.
Mm. Yeah, it's true that you realize that you love a subject because you don't get tired of talking about it. You can talk about it for hours. So, okay, so a lot of approaches, and there are not all of them. We just made a selection, or those are the most important ones, these 28. Sometimes the differences are subtle, but still, difference are important and they're different. They're not the same. Each of them is different from the others.
An example is gender focused versus feminist, is the extent to which the evaluation is actually trying to make a change in gender equity versus simply studying gender equity is a difference. Participatory and empowerment are degrees of engagement different, but they're important differences. And that's why an approach emerges, is to deal with something they think other approaches haven't done adequately, so they introduce a new approach.
Yeah, I was thinking like they may be like little families that we could also play around with at some point because, oh, yeah, also transformative also reminded me of democratic or things like that.
They're in
Um,
the same mold, but they're slightly different focus because they think something's missing in what the others have done. So,
yeah.
for example, to use that example, that the transformative approach includes different people and telling their stories, the democratic deliberative process makes sure that they actually talk to each other.
Mm. Okay, so yeah, that's why I'm thinking that maybe we could do like families, about the ones that are talking about representativity, the ones that are talking about gender or injustice or inequities. Okay, so a lot of them, but different. Not to mix, not to confuse approaches with methods, right? Because often in the methodology sections in evaluation reports, you don't clearly see the approaches. You see the methods, but they don't discuss the approaches.
Yeah. And so methods don't reduce to approaches, but they are included. And as you mentioned, some of the approaches are heavily defined methodologically. So appreciative inquiry is a focus, a way of thinking about the evaluation, but it's also a method for doing it. Systems evaluation is both a focus on an evaluand, but there are methods involved in how to do systems analysis and how to do systems evaluation. So approaches often lead to particular kind of methods, but it's not reducible to methods.
Mhm. Okay, the next idea is that you cannot do evaluation without an approach, although you are maybe not aware of the approach you're using.
As you said, often the reports and evaluation report methods, but not approach, so that they don't even recognize, for example, if the report is about whether a program achieved its goals, that they're using a goals-based approach and that there are other things that could have been done. So there are some default kinds of ways of operating that sort of hide the approach. We're trying to elevate that and say, whatever you've done somewhere in there, you actually are following an approach, whether you know it or not.
Mhm. And linked to that, there's no neutral approach, but there's some generic that we all see over and over, which is this results-based approach, which is probably the most common one, right?
Did the intervention achieve goals? That's often the main focus. It's an accountability focus. It's a reporting focus. And it's so widespread that it's not even considered an approach because it's so widespread. But what we're saying is to recognize that that's one approach and that there are many other options that use the periodic table to think about, well, should we or could we or might we be useful to do some of these other approaches added in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's our bottom line, what we're trying to encourage here. The next thought is that each approach is not casual, has a priority, and so is somehow political.
Yeah, choices are political in the sense that there are implications of power and decision making and context involved. And so we've become more explicit about recognizing how choices get made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I'm following my donor's orientations, then I'm following its lead, and then that's a political choice. Then it's interesting that since we have different evaluants, but we also can have different purposes, like we saw in the purposes video, that would lead to different approaches, that would lead to different focus, and therefore, what we say about the same evaluant may be different because our lenses change, and that is very interesting.
The example we've used of a global alliance working on cybercrime and working on the ways in which women and girls in particular are at risk in the cyber world, the different parts of that global alliance, from the projects and programs it might do, or taking a demonstration approach, or looking at the network, or looking at the organizations that are involved, those are different evaluands, and you could do different kinds of approaches to evaluation for those different evaluands that would involve a different focus, lead to different findings and different implications.
Hmm. As we saw that some different evaluants call better for different approaches, they go more naturally together. For
So
example,
goals-based goes with projects more, and systems change goes with a systems approach, and transformation goes with major kind of initiatives that are trying to have a big impact on larger scale systems.
hmm. And finally, you don't need to do it, but I often use, for example, a mix of approaches. So mixing approaches is interesting when you want to look at your different hands and you have more than one hand.
Exactly. You look back and forth and you ultimately integrate. I mean, even though can't look at the center of both hands at the same time, you can put your hands together and join those different pieces and put your hands together with some other folks.
Hmm.
We are. Here we are. So yeah, but the point is to be explicit. Some approaches are conflicting. And so you want to be clear that you don't just have silos, but that you look at what the relationships are, how those approaches support each other.
Hmm. Great. So this is what we had for you today. We have been working on how to do approaches because this is just explaining the 28 approaches, exactly what they focus on, but of course we cannot explain how to do each of them. But we have things on the works that hopefully see the light at some point, we haven't published yet. We also have the glossary that also explains all these terms, not only approaches, but all the other categories in the table. And I think that's it. We can talk for hours, but hopefully this was, in a nutshell, evaluation approaches.
Like to work with you as ever.
Yeah,
And we thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Stay tuned. There's more to come.
I'm so lucky. Thank you, Michael. Bye.
Bye.